A lot of times when it comes to comparisons I make, you will see some flagships going head to head, a different brand versus a different brand, and naturally showcasing their difference in approach. This includes the camera hardware as well. But not only are we talking about the same brand today, we're also talking about very similar hardware. So let's discuss the camera difference between the Vivo X200 FE and the V60 and showcase the difference between both of them, because while the hardware might be quite similar, there are actually differences when it comes to the way that both of them process the images, including a new mode, but that is really for the separate video of the phone itself to showcase that new mode. So be sure to check out the solo video on, of course, the Vivo V60 and the camera capabilities of it. So let's begin with that similar hardware, and yes, it does make my job a lot easier. We're dealing with a 50 megapixel main sensor that is a 23mm equivalent focal length and an f-stop of 1.9, and then a 1/1.56 inch sensor size. Then we have another 50 megapixel sensor, and that is the Telephoto, 70mm equivalent with an f-stop of 2.7 and a 1/1.95 inch sensor size. And finally, a weaker link, an 8 megapixel ultrawide sensor, an f-stop of 2.0, 50mm equivalent and a 1/4 inch sensor size. Yes, this counts for both phones. But we know that results aren't just down to the camera hardware, they also come down to processing. The Vivo X200 FE uses the MediaTek Dimensity 9300 Plus. Meanwhile, the Vivo V60 runs on the Snapdragon 7 Gen 4. There's also a difference in display size. The Vivo V60 comes with quite a large 6.77 inch AMOLED display, while the Vivo X200 FE comes with a 6.31 inch AMOLED display. At their core, these are very similar devices, similar design, same brand and nearly the same philosophy, especially with the size collaboration. But when we look at the results, things do get somewhat interesting. Based on the shots that I've taken, the two phones do share quite a bit of similarities, but the processing is different. Sometimes I prefer the X200 FE and sometimes I prefer the Vivo V60. I do feel like both of them are a little bit more brighter than I would like them to be. It's not a huge difference, but still, when it comes to this difference, it is noticeable. The best way to describe it is a sea lion versus seals, or Olympic and Britannic to Titanic. They look similar, but if you look at the details, you will see that there's a difference nonetheless. Now, despite their CPU difference, shutter speed and the overall camera use remains almost identical. It's hard to point out any significant difference here when using the main sensor. However, one note is worthy here. The Vivo X200 FE includes the humanistic mode. The Vivo V60 doesn't. Instead, it introduces a new feature called film camera. I've made a dedicated video on the Vivo V60 where you can check out what that means in terms of results. When it comes to processing between the two, in terms of quality, there are some subtle differences. Sometimes you will notice quite a bit more sharpening on the Vivo V60 compared to the FE. But the bigger changes appear in low light. The X200 FE handles highlights better. Take light sources beneath the bridge, they are managed far better on the Vivo X200 FE compared to the V60. And then the color profile. More often than not, the Vivo V60 tends to lean towards that warmer tone, apart from some few rare cases. And truthfully, that warmer look fits my city nicer and also in some cases is more representing the city of Arnhem. when it comes to comparing the same brand against itself, a lot of it comes down to small changes. Maybe slightly better processing, maybe a shift in the color of the shot itself. And with the telephoto lenses on both devices being the same, I honestly can repeat what I said with the main sensor. They share the same focal length, and while there are differences between the two, nothing really stands out that much. Although there are two things that I need to mention. The greens to start with and the contrast on them. On the Vivo V60 I actually prefer it. The greens appear more dark and more natural compared to the X200 FE that has an even exposure on them. But in turn there's a trade-off when it comes to the telephoto. That sharpening that I mentioned earlier, it becomes far more noticeable on the V60 when using the telephoto, especially on trees. And in case of the telephoto, for my taste, it actually becomes a little bit too much for me. Now the weakest link for both of these phones, the Ultrawide. In daytime, the sensor and processing are fine. In fact, I even go as far as saying this is the best performance I've seen from this particular sensor compared to many other devices that use the same. That being said, I don't believe either of these phones should be using this kind of ultrawide. Imagine what they can do with a slightly better one. Naturally, it would affect the price though, so it really depends on what you think about that one. And yes, there are some slight differences in processing again, but it's very much a rinse and repeat. The V60 sharpened things up more compared to the FE, just like it did with the telephoto. And while in daytime they perform decently, in low light the ultrawide begins to struggle. Details fall apart, noise creeps in, and really tough scenes become a real challenge. That sharpening I mentioned before is also more noticeable here in many cases, especially on the V60 compared to the FE. Simply put, the ultrawide is able to capture some good shots when it is daytime. When it's low light, it won't do that well. For those who know me, when it comes to portrait mode, it is always tricky for me. I don't want to approach strangers and then look like a bit of a weirdo, because simply put, especially these days, you will be seen as that, and I don't really want to bother anyone. But I try my best to step out that comfort zone so I can showcase it for you. Now, there aren't many examples here to show, and yes, some basalts look a little bit like wax figures. It's probably because they are. Still, there are differences when looking at the shots. That warmer hue that the Vivo V60 tends to carry can really benefit a portrait, especially with a lighter skin tone. The X200 FE, on the other hand, feels a bit more detailed, but in return also introduces a little bit more sharpening. Now in black and white, I think both of these phones shine. Looking at the full shot, each deliver an excellent result. And of course, if you need a bit of a softer light, use Ultrawide. While it still can be a bit harsh, it does help a little bit when the lighting isn't optimal. Naturally, if you are from Arnhem and you don't mind portraits being taken of you, let me know in the comments below. It would really help out. Now in this comparison, you will see that there are some slight differences between the two and how they approach their photography. And in terms of still, I wouldn't say there's a clear winner. But there is one segment where the Vivo X200 FE easily takes the win. And that is video recording. At 30 frames per second, both phones perform well and quality is comparable. No real complaints here. But there's a problem. The V60 is capped at that 30 frames per second, and that limitation holds it back, especially when you compare it to the X200 FE. With the X200 FE, it can slow down the footage, it can create more of a cinematic and more stable look. The V60, on the other hand, doesn't leave much room to play with. So while the Vivo X200 FE and V60 share pretty much the same camera hardware, the Vivo X200 FE can actually switch in 4K 30 frames per second to the telephoto, but also it can record to 4K 30 frames per second. The Vivo V60 cannot do that. So it's limited to the 4K 30 frames per second, and it can only go and crop in on the main sensor, which of course naturally the Vivo X200 FE can do as well. You can however stop recording and then go to 4K 30 frames per second and then use the telephoto on the Vivo V60. When using 1080p and 30 frames per second, you can switch between all different focal lengths, however, for both. Show a direct side by side, very different colors. I would actually say the X200 FE is a bit closer to reality when it comes to the short, at least on my iPhone. So at the end, when it comes to the Vivo X200 FE and the V60, they are quite similar in certain ways, especially when it comes to the camera hardware. But when it comes to processing, we do actually see a difference between both of them. And that difference, I feel like when it comes to the Vivo X200 FE, it often is a little bit brighter than it should be. Yes, you can compensate for it, but I feel like the Vivo V60 does that part a little bit better. It has better control over the brightness of the shot itself. Yes, naturally that comes down to preference as well, but when I ask for instance the portrait difference between both of these, when it comes to the colored one, because when it was black and white it was shift around, the person that I shot a colored portrait of actually preferred the shot on the Vivo V60 because it wasn't as bright. And that is how they do it both in terms of like stock capabilities of it. When it comes to the black and white version, the one preferred the X200 FE because of that little bit more brightness in the background itself, making it a little bit nicer for black and white portrait photography. Either way, when it comes to both of these, yes, both of them are very capable, and it's going to depend on whether you shoot a lot of video or not, especially if you like slowing down the video, because then the Vivo V60 is simply too limited. With 4K and 30 frames per second, you are limited to that 30 frames per second. You cannot go higher and then slow down the footage. That allows for a little bit more of that dramatic look that you can create when it comes to 4K 60 frames per second. Either way, let me know at the end which one you prefer, the Vivo X200 FE or do you prefer the Vivo V60? Let me know in the comments below. Either way, before we leave, I really want to thank my members. Thank you so much for the support. It really means a lot to me, so I really appreciate you supporting me. Of course, if you want to support my channel, you can by subscribing, but also of course become a member. If you don't want to, just subscribe, like the video, comment and everything like that. If you enjoy my content, it really helps out a channel size like mine. Either way, I do hope that you enjoyed the video, and of course, talk to you guys in the next.